I'm really excited to introduce you to my friend and my CEO, Mr. Jeff Weiner. He has been with LinkedIn since December of 2008, and during that time, under his leadership, we have grown our member base from 33 million to nearly 675 million members. We've increased revenue from 78 million to 7.5 billion. And we have scaled this unique culture you've been hearing about today across its more than 30 offices around the world. So, Jeff, today we've spent, with these lovely people here, a day of learning about their companies, what makes their culture special, what's unique about them. And we've been talking to Rosanna. And we've talked to David White about metrics. And we've talked to the L&D team. And we had Jackie come up and talk about InDay. So in the same vein, they've also shared with us programs that are really unique to each of them. I promised them earlier in the day that we were going to bring you in to tell us a little bit about how it came to have our culture and values. But before I do, I want to address one thing, which is yesterday we made an announcement.
We did?
We made an announcement.
Always the last to know these things.
That effective June 1st, Jeff is changing roles, and he is going to be our executive chairman at LinkedIn. And what I wanted to ask you in front of all these people who are right here in person seeing it for the first time is why, and why now?
Sure. So thanks to everyone for joining us. It's a subject that's near and dear to all of our hearts at LinkedIn, and it's become a real competitive advantage for us. So it's always fun to have the opportunity to share what we've learned with regard to developing culture. Very briefly, with regard to yesterday, yes, we did announce that I'm going to be moving on to my next play, which is executive chairman of LinkedIn, and that Ryan Roslansky, who is currently our global head of product, was my first hire here, interestingly enough, all the way back in December, January of 2008, 2009. He's going to become our next CEO effective June 1st. I could not be more excited about my new role. I'm going to be focused on supporting Ryan and the team, first priority, coaching and mentoring future leaders at the company. I'll be involved in strategy whenever asked. I'm not going to invite myself. I learned that lesson from my predecessor in the executive chairman role, who's our visionary founder, Reid Hoffman, who played that role for me, and he was extraordinary at it. I will represent the company externally with partners, customers, governments, and the media, if I can help in that respect. And then I think that the area I'll be most focused on in terms of time and energy is going to be the realization of our vision, and that is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. And it's the every member part that I'll be focused on. Our mission is to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful. That's a addressable opportunity of about 770 million, 780 million knowledge workers in the world, and that includes students, pre-professionals. There's 3.5 billion people in the global workforce, so there's a big delta between the mission and the vision. I'll be focused on the vision part of this. That's where the lion's share of my time and energy will be, and that will range from efforts to help close the network gap, this idea that social capital plays a far greater role in the way in which people who have the requisite skills and capabilities are sometimes shut out of opportunities because they don't know the right people. They didn't grow up in the right neighborhoods. They didn't go to the right schools. They didn't graduate or work at the right companies. And as a result, they suffer from a vicious cycle where the decision makers and the hiring managers and the recruiters within the organizations that they seek to become an employee of are drawn to people like them. The people that they know, the people in their networks. And that's a very virtuous cycle for the people that benefit from those connections, and a very vicious cycle for those that don't. So I'm going to be focused on helping to turn those vicious cycles into virtuous ones, because if we can redefine what a connection means on LinkedIn, if we can help extremely deserving people who have all the talent and all the skills, but don't necessarily have those three criteria in terms of the neighborhood, the school, and the jobs or the previous work experience, we can help them become the influencers within their organizations. We can help them become the recruiters and hiring managers. And then, in turn, they're going to hire the people that they know. And so we can turn these vicious cycles into virtuous ones. So a lot of different, thanks. A lot of different ways in which we can do that, which if we have time remaining, I can get into the specifics of that. In terms of why now, we could spend literally the next 20 minutes on this, which is what we did at the All Hands yesterday. I'm going to do it in 30 seconds. It's the right time for 3 reasons. Company has never performed better than it's performing right now. Nina mentioned our revenue. It's beyond surreal. We did $7.5 billion trailing 12 months. It was up 27% year over year. When I joined the company, we had $78 million of revenue. It's nearly 100x growth in revenue. It's beyond. And it's not just revenue. It's every conceivable core KPI that we look at. Engagement, all-time highs. We just literally hit another hourly high in terms of page views, sessions, daily actives, monthly actives, job seekers, job applications, searches, the whole thing. The brand's never been stronger. We're in the top 100 for the first time ever, thanks to the woman who just recently became our CMO, Mel Selker, who prior to that had comms and branding, and her and the team just did an outstanding job in terms of our brand strategy. Now a top 100 brand, one of the 10 fastest growing brands in the world. Very apropos of today's discussion, our culture's never been stronger. That's not just anecdotal, it's empirical. Attrition's at a 5-year low. We're hiring engineers at the fastest absolute clip in the company's history. Employee engagement is hovering at all-time highs. Confidence in the future, all-time highs, you name it. And then lastly, the future has never been clearer in terms of our understanding of how to create value, what it is that we're trying to accomplish, cause and effect, how to connect the dots. Which brings me to the second point, which is my successor has never been more ready, and he's the chief architect of an understanding of how our ecosystem works. I mentioned he was my first hire. I've actually been working with him for nearly 20 years. He was one of the first people I started working with at Yahoo back in 2001. He's a gifted guy, Ryan Roslansky, and the company is going to be in very, very good hands. And I think in many respects, he is far better than I could ever be if you think about where the company is headed going forward. And then lastly, it just feels like the right time. It's a personal decision, and I always thought it was going to come down to my happiness and whether or not I was happy here. And it turns out that if happiness is the final criteria, I'm probably going to still be the CEO here into my late 80s, early 90s, and I don't know how effective I'm going to be at that point in my career. I love this place. The sense of purpose for the organization, my own sense of purpose, have become so inextricably linked I can no longer separate them, which is why I can't see myself working anywhere else, and why this executive chairman role is not titular, it's not a figurehead role, it's very real. It's the ultimate platform for the impact that I hope to have on the world. I absolutely love and adore the people. They're the best team I've ever worked with. And I have some growing interests outside of the day-to-day of LinkedIn. I started a nonprofit called the Compassion Project, which is seeking to ensure that compassion is taught in every elementary school in the United States. We started a year and a half ago. 13,000 of 70,000 schools in the United States have signed up, elementary schools. So a lot of momentum. I'll do some investing and I'll do some teaching. Developed coursework on leadership, and very excited to teach that both inside and outside of LinkedIn.
So I just have to add that yesterday this announcement was made. We had an all hands. It went out on the feed. There was some publicity around it. And I had a fair number of people reach out to me because when you have a major change in a company, people were like, how are you? How's it going? You okay? And I have responded to almost every single person saying, first of all, I've had a wonderful time here, but yesterday was one of the most joyful days I've ever spent at LinkedIn because of the passion you can see that he has. It's so exciting. He is, people say, is he stepping down as CEO? And I'm like, no, he's stepping up as executive chairman. So it's a completely different point of view.
I got to trademark that line. I like that line. I'm not stepping down.
So now let's bring it back. So Jeff, he joined it's been 11 years. And can you tell us a little bit about how you thought about culture and values before you came to LinkedIn? How that changed once you were here, and then how did you codify it? How did you and the leadership bring us to where we are?
Sure. So I'm going to speak quickly because I think we have somewhat limited time. I know, Nina, you have some questions you want to ask me. I know you want to turn it over for Q&A. Yeah. If I'm talking too quick, and I think it's going to be hopefully valuable to you, so I'm going to try to get it all out there. If I'm talking too quickly, I'll dial it down. And don't be hesitant to raise your hand, and we can make this interactive. It doesn't have to be a traditional fireside. Very passionate about this subject matter. You guys are going to think I'm passionate about everything the way I'm going. So you're not just passionate about this. So if you had asked me about culture and values prior to joining LinkedIn, I more likely than not would have rolled my eyes at you as a younger executive, and I probably would have cited some Dilbert comic strip. I just thought it was a joke. I thought it was a joke. There was no organization I worked at prior to LinkedIn where anyone took culture and value seriously. Painted on the walls, hand out the laminated cards, the mouse pads, and we do some of that here. But if you don't take it seriously and you're not committed to it and you don't walk the walk and you don't hire against it and you don't onboard against it and you don't develop against it and you don't evaluate performance against it, you don't create feedback loops every day in every way and have your leadership just go all in on it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So it wasn't until I got here and I took the role of CEO for the first time in my life that I realized its potential importance and significance, because in the earliest days, Nina mentioned the growth rate of the membership and she mentioned the growth rate of the revenue. It turns out, with regard to employees, there were 338 employees here when I joined. Today we have 16,300. And we could all fit in a break room, like where you go to get snacks and stuff. That's where we used to do all hands at our old office. And what was interesting was we started growing so quickly. When I got here, unbeknownst to me, they had just done layoffs. No one told me about that before while they were recruiting me. They had laid off 36 people. It was actually quite serious. And we started turning around. We started growing faster. And we couldn't hire fast enough. And I started to recognize, and it was brought to my attention, that if we didn't codify our culture and values, what was going to end up happening was people were going to bring their cultural baggage with them. And nature abhors a vacuum. Nature does not like vacuums, and it will fill it. And we are of nature. So people don't like vacuums either. So if you join a team or an organization and there's no clearly defined sense of culture or values, you are going to insert your own. And back then, we were hiring from eBay and Google and Yahoo and you name it. And those companies were very different than one another. And the people that came from those organizations were very different from one another. And if they were in a position of influence, they would unpack their cultural baggage, for better and for worse. So that's really important because I used to say that building a hypergrowth company is like putting a rocket out into space. If you're off by inches at launch, you'll be off by miles out in orbit because of the sheer trajectory. So these little mistakes you make in the early days can have dire consequences longer term once you scale. And so recognize we all needed to be rowing in the same direction when it came to culture and value. So we took the time to codify it. We took the time to first define what culture meant. Culture, try this exercise when you go back home. Ask people what they think culture is and ask people what they think values are. And start writing down not your culture or your values, but just the word. And you'll get a bunch of different answers. So we took the time to define that. So culture here for LinkedIn is the collective personality of our organization. It's who we are and who we aspire to be. This aspect of aspiration is the secret sauce. If you guys get up on stage and you try to roll out a culture and you say, this is it, this is who we are, period, people's eyes are going to roll back into their heads because you're going to say something inevitably that you're not honoring every day, the team's not honoring every day. I mean, we're human. We make mistakes. We're not always consistent. So if you don't add this aspect of aspiration, the moment you don't walk the walk, people are waiting to pounce and say, I knew it was a joke. It's just the way we are. It's just human nature, right? Poking holes. So this aspirational component gives you the leeway to say, this is who we aspire to be. This is the personality we want for our organization longer term. And we're going to do everything within our power to get there, but we'll make some mistakes along the way. So it creates far more allowance for inconsistency, and we're all inconsistent because we're all human beings. Values are the first principles upon which we make day-to-day decisions. And values help create a culture. They're nested underneath the culture. And I had learned an exercise years before joining LinkedIn from a guy named Fred Kaufman. Some of you may know that name. He wrote a book called Conscious Business. Highly recommend it. And Fred talks about doing an exercise to develop values based on the Greek philosophers' study of living a virtuous life. And they wrote tomes on it. I mean, volumes. So if there's any philosophy majors here, you may recall the Cliff Notes version. Anyone remember Cliff Notes? Am I aging myself? Remember those little yellow and black things at the end of the aisle in the corner store? So the Cliff Notes version is if you want to live a virtuous life, you emulate the people you most are inspired by and you most admire. And so the exercise is to sit down with your team and ask them to select someone, dead or alive, fact or fiction, real or not real, who you aspire to be like, who you are inspired by. one person, a quality that you most admire or inspired by in that person, and an anecdote that demonstrates the manifestation of that quality. And then someone's taking notes on the whiteboard, and they write down what the quality is, not the person, not the story. But it's a super cool way to get to know the team. And oftentimes people will talk about a late grandmother or a family member or an old boss, or it's not always Gandhi and Mother Teresa. You'll get some of those too. But what you're going to find is, if it's the right team and they were drawn by the right things, a lot of commonality in terms of the qualities. And that becomes the jumping off point for your values. The other way to think about values, which I find to be very effective, is to listen to what your leadership talks about over and over and over again, their own personal mantras, the stuff that you guys make jokes about behind their backs. And if you had drinking games at your office and they started throwing around those expressions, everyone would be drunk all the time because it's just constant. Those expressions are values, and they're values that are much easier to live by because they're already baked into the way you guys do your thing. So that's how we started to think about values. We started to think about culture in terms of what kind of personality we wanted to embody as an organization. And once those were codified, the most important thing, so that was foundational. We're probably addressing most of the questions you were going to ask me, so I'll just keep going. So, so I'm sure somewhere on the list was then, how did you reinforce it? Is that right?
I was going to say, how did we, my question to you was going to be, that was 2008, 2009. Here we are in 2020, and they're as strong as ever in every office around. How?
Yeah.
How?
So the most important thing we did after codifying it was ensuring that we were evaluating performance against it. Virtually every organization in the world evaluates performance based on results. The what? And it makes all the sense in the world. I get it. But if you are rewarding people who gain results, who are bad actors within your organization, then you are going to be sending all the wrong signals to the rest of the team. Not only that you are hypocritical, not only that the values and the culture that you've codified for them and taken the trouble to roll out doesn't really mean much, but that those are the people that get rewarded. That bad behavior, in a sense, is not only overlooked, it's rewarded. So they're modeling the worst behaviors. And I get it. I know why it's so hard to potentially have to have hard conversations with those individuals, or maybe even have to transition them outside the organization. But that's how you build your culture and your values. So conversely, we were trying to figure out a way to reward the right behavior. And so from the very earliest days, when we started to set up our performance criteria, I made sure that my directs understood that the first principles upon which that was launched was half results and half honoring culture and values. And that changes behavior in a big way, because you can have someone who's a superstar performer, but if they're a bad actor, then they're not performing to the best of your expectations of them. And ultimately, what's going to get them to the next level in an organization that takes culture and values so seriously. And once people understood that, they start rolling up their sleeves and digging into, okay, what's the culture again? What are the values again? How do I practice the values on a daily basis? Who are my role models? Who should I ask to mentor me? How do I get coached on this stuff? You know, incentives are very, very powerful things. And there's a lot of unintended consequences to focusing on the what at the exclusion of the how. So at LinkedIn, we've always tried to strike the right balance between the what and the how, the mission, the vision, the culture, and the values. And then I kind of mentioned the kind of continuum through which you have to reinforce this behavior. That was an example of performance evaluation, but it starts with recruiting. And this is the other most important thing we did with regard to setting up culture and values in the right way. We said that in the earliest days, we were trying to put butts in seats, and we were trying to keep up with demand, and there were so many critical roles that needed to be filled. So I remember, like it was yesterday, a recruiting effort, committee of decision makers and hiring managers, may have even been my directs, and we were looking to fill a very important executive role, and we were handing out the packet of LinkedIn profiles, and we got to one, and the hiring manager was super excited about this person's experience, the companies they had worked at, what they had done prior. But they also went to the trouble of saying, I don't think they're going to be a cultural fit out of the gate based on some of these experiences. For example, large company experience versus more entrepreneurial background. But that'll be fine. We'll make it work. this person was going to coach them, and it was all going to be okay. So how do you think that worked out? Not so hot, huh? So every time you do that, and the more senior you make these compromises, the more damage it does, because that person is influencing the people underneath them, and they're modeling the wrong behavior. And you know, it's so hard in those earliest days to admit mistakes along those lines and to make those hard decisions. And so sometimes you have the wrong person in the right role, and they're lingering for too long, and it's no good all the way around. So we learned some painful lessons that way. And once the painful lessons were learned, I remember having a very similar discussion about a year, year and a half later, another critical position. And the packet went around, and we got to a profile, and someone said, look at this person's background, look at these companies, look at these skills. Unfortunately, I don't think they're a cultural fit, so let's move on to the next candidate. I was like, yeah, right. And that's really powerful when that starts happening. It's even more powerful and much more scalable when it happens when you're not in the room. And that's how you know you're on the right track. But in those earliest days, when you're building a team and you're expanding globally, you know, it's one thing to be able to rein in a culture, a cultural misbehavior or someone who's not acting out the values in the right way when they work with you. But when you start expanding globally, you can't see that stuff. You're only hearing about it after the fact, when people are starting to complain or there's lots of issues or friction or churn. So getting that right is critical. So codifying culture and values, doing that in the right way. Making sure that you are not compromising on culture and values with regard to the recruiting process. Onboarding against it. Recruiting is just the beginning. Day one, people need to understand how seriously you take that stuff. And then it needs to be baked into your ongoing development, manager effectiveness, just expectation setting, helping people get to the next level. And then it's the performance component that we just talked about.
I think a couple other things is something we do every 2 weeks, which is our all hands. That is somewhere we talk about it quite a bit. Mm-hmm. But also sometimes when we've been up against tough issues or we have to make some decisions, we kind of use it as a guidepost that really helps us make the right decision often. I'm going to let you guys ask a couple of questions, but I want to just talk about one other thing, which Jeff mentioned a little earlier, around compassionate management. And if you could tell us a little bit about what that means to you, and then you mentioned it, but could you tell a little bit more about the Compassion Project? Sure.
So very briefly, and we'll turn it over to you guys. Compassionate management is exactly what it sounds like. It's managing with compassion. It's leading others with compassion. And I was never, ever taught anything about compassion. Growing up as a child, I'm sure my parents were teaching me golden rule and stuff like that, but I don't recall the word compassion being thrown around very often. When I got to college, I went to Wharton undergrad. I studied economics. It was not taught at Wharton, to put it mildly. No one ever mentioned it at the first consulting strategy shop I worked at. I never heard the word compassion, ever. I didn't really understand the true meaning and definition of compassion until I was 30 years old. I read a book called The Art of Happiness. It's by a guy named Howard Cutler, and it's about the teachings of the Dalai Lama. And it doesn't matter how spiritual you are, whether or not you're religious, he's got a lot of interesting things to say. And it was in that book that I finally understood the true meaning of compassion, which I had been using synonymously with empathy for essentially my entire adult life. And that's not unusual in Western society. I think we all have a tendency to do that. It turns out there's a fundamental difference between the two. Empathy is feeling what another living thing feels. Compassion is putting yourself in the shoes of another person, seeing the world through their lens for the sake of alleviating their suffering. So simply put, compassion is empathy plus action. Empathy is a means to an end. And if you just focus on empathy, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And the way the Dalai Lama illustrates this is if you were walking along a mountainous trail and you came across someone who had a boulder on their chest, not that this is going to happen to any of us in the near future, but it paints a vivid picture. The empathetic response would be to feel the same sense of crushing suffocation that that individual is feeling. And now you can't breathe, they can't breathe, and you're rendered helpless. You're of no good to anyone. The compassionate response is to draw upon your own life experiences and maybe think empathetically for a moment, like, oh, I remember when I was suffocating once and how painful and horrific that was. And now in recognizing that person's suffering, you do everything within your power to remove the boulder from their chest. So how does that translate into a work environment? First of all, you don't have to raise the bar as high as alleviating other people's suffering. It can be to help them achieve an objective. So you can start there. But how this manifests itself at work is that oftentimes as leaders, especially less experienced executives, and that was certainly the case for me, we are all egocentric. We are wired to be egocentric, not to be confused with egomaniacal. We see the world through our own lens. It helps protect us and keep us safe because we draw upon a lifetime of experiences, what we've learned. So we're all egocentric. Egomaniacal is the world revolving around you, and that's not good for a whole host of reasons. And Silicon Valley knows egomaniacism. So. And so an egocentric approach to management is, well, I'm a manager, I just got promoted, or I'm an executive, I'm a junior executive, and obviously I'm being rewarded for doing something right. So I'm going to expect everyone around me to do things the way I do them. And if they don't, I'm going to tell them that they should. And I may get frustrated when they don't do it exactly the way I did it. And I'm going to express that frustration. And I'm going to hold them accountable to something that potentially they're not even capable of doing. That's a more egocentric way of managing. A more compassionate way of managing is to recognize that the other person has their own strengths and weaknesses. And those may be different than your own. That they may be able to do the job differently than you can do it. Understanding their hopes, their dreams, their fears, their insecurities, and playing to their strength, coaching them on their weaknesses, and doing everything within your power to set them up to be successful. That's one example of managing compassionately. A second one, and then we'll just keep going, we'll open up for Q&A, is that we all experience conflict at work, all of us, arguably every day. Hopefully it's manageable and tolerable. Oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes you're in a meeting and someone triggers you or you trigger them. And you start butting heads. People get defensive, people get angry, people get insecure and try to mask it, you name it. It happens to all of us. And in those moments, if you're angry and I'm having an empathetic response, now I'm angry. If you're defensive, I'm defensive. If you're insecure, I'm insecure. That's only going to escalate the problem. This is how most of us operate. Not only that, we take the egocentric view. So if you're angry or you don't support me in something that I'm arguing, obviously something's wrong with you because there's nothing wrong with me. Everything I'm saying is spot on. And if I'm angry, it's because of you. You did something to me. That's egocentrism. And to manage compassionately, it starts with a sense of mindfulness, being in the moment, being a spectator to your own thoughts, especially when you become emotional, recognizing that you may be triggered, recognizing that perhaps this person has no nefarious intention. They're not a bad person, but they may be experiencing something that has led them to behave the way that they're behaving. It's got nothing to do with you. And then recognizing that, trying to de-escalate the situation, saying, I'm sorry if I made you angry. It certainly wasn't my intention. We're both here trying to get something done, hopefully a shared objective, so let's start over. Or maybe you could explain to me what's upsetting you. And that starts to de-escalate the situation. You can get back to business. Far more importantly, that person now feels like you have their back, that it's we and not two eyes, that you're on the same page, that you're in it together. And so in the case of the former, the more egocentric approach to that, that friction remains, the meeting ends, and then guess what you do? You go back to your team and you complain about the other person. You're modeling the wrong behavior, taking all this negative energy outside the conference room. People start going to their natural tribes. It's us against them. And then that starts scaling and compounding across the entire organization. And the flip side is that if you can get this compassionate management approach right, you leave that meeting, and then the two people go back to their teams and go, the most incredible thing just happened. I was in the middle of really mixing it up with this person or this team that we typically always fight with, and then we were able to figure it out. And it was amazing. And then the teammate says, well, how did you do it? And then you share the behavior, and then that starts to compound. And if you get it right, you start to build trust within an organization as opposed to conflict. And that trust becomes foundational for making better decisions faster because it leads to shorthand. And it leads to not constantly questioning what the other person's trying to get over on you or whether or not they're being territorial or trying to undermine you. You can just focus on the work at hand.
Do we have some questions in the audience?
The sociological or anthropological discussion on a cult would not be too strongly delineated from any institutional organization. It's just whether or not the intentions are positive or negative, constructive or destructive. A cult loosely defined is a group of people who believe deeply in something. If that something is going to destroy value or destroy people, it's not good. If that something is super positive and inspiring and it's going to create value, then great. And in a sense, every organization we've ever been a part of, every institution we've ever been a part of, I mean, have you ever watched people attending a college basketball game or a college football game? How do you think that would look to a Martian coming down to Earth? You think they describe that as a cult? It'd be a really weird cult, too. All dressed in the same color, jumping up and down, losing their minds every time someone throws a ball through a circle. That's weird behavior. But when you're in it, it feels awesome. And it connects one another, people with one another, and you're all in it, and you feel great, and it's exhilarating, and no one's being harmed by it. So, culture, and it's funny, and it's probably the impetus for your question, or the origin, culture, cult, right? So it's really about what you want to do with it. When you bring all these people together and you're repeating the same messages over and over, and you have people relying on one another, sometimes existentially, you're going to be able to develop some really strong relationships and bonds and energy. And the question is, what do you want to do with that? What I have been faced with is something every individual is faced with, every individual manager at some point in their career. And it actually comes back to managing compassionately. And it's the most frequently asked question I get when it comes to compassion, which is, okay, so you aspire to manage compassionately. How in the world would you ever let anyone go? Because that's not compassionate. And the short answer is that one of the least compassionate things you can do is leave an underperforming employee in a role where they're over their head. And yet that's what most of us do, because we're fearful. We're fearful of what people are going to think of us if we let that person go. We're fearful of whether or not we're going to be able to replace them. We're fearful of hurting them personally. We're fearful of what they're going to say about us. There's a lot of fear that goes into that. But if you're managing compassionately and putting yourself in the shoes of that person, you will recognize that they have become a shadow of their former selves. And you've all seen it. We all have. The individual who's in a role and they're over their heads. Their body language changes slowly but surely. They may have once sat like this at the conference table, and now they do this. And whereas they once used to speak up and assert themselves and say, I believe we should go forward with this plan, now they are talking kind of like this, if they're speaking up at all. And their team is starting to question things, and they're not really showing up for them. And it's not good for anyone. And it undermines everything about your organization. It undermines you as a leader or a manager who's left that person in the role. When that person's team knows they're not really up to the task, it undermines the culture and the values probably in some way, shape, or form. I can almost guarantee it. It hurts the team because now they have an underperforming person who's overseeing them. And worst of all, this person that's losing their sense of self and their self-esteem and their dignity is taking that energy home with them to their family. So in those situations, it's best to put yourself in their shoes and have an open, honest, and constructive conversation. That's another value at LinkedIn, be open, honest, and constructive. Not just be open and honest and kind of shield yourself by virtue of tearing other people down because you celebrate radical transparency. I think constructiveness is an enormously important part of that. But to sit down with them and to be open, honest, and constructive and say, for your role, this is where the bar is set. This is where you're performing. I want you to be successful. I want you to close this gap. I hired you. I'm rooting for you. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to coach you. We're going to get you coaching, whatever it is. These are the skills I'd like to work with you on. This is the amount of time that we need to see progress. And I'm going to be transparent with you as to how things are progressing. And I'm going to do everything within my power to get you at that bar or above it. And if it doesn't work out, I'm going to work with you on ideally finding something else within the organization. And if for whatever reason that doesn't work out, I'll do everything within my power to help you outside of the organization. And that's an example of managing compassionately. Recognize, I've been in business for 28 years. It grows every year, I have to say. I turned 50 in 2 weeks, by the way. The words still get stuck in my mouth.
So I've been in business 28 years, and in all of the time I've been responsible for managing people, I haven't had a single person, not one, ever come to me and say, I can't do my job. It's not their job, it's yours. It's ours.
So that was a master class. I would think we'd all agree on leadership. And I also think that that nicely tied together everything we've talked about today into this. So thank you so much,
Sure.
Jeff. That was
my pleasure.
absolutely amazing.